I'm recording, but I'm testing things out.
Yes.
So it sounds good. So just tell me a little bit. This is not part of the recording.
Yeah.
So just tell me a little bit.
Well, as I started to say, we moved into Hastings in 1928. I went to kindergarten in Irvington, and my parents moved from Irvington to Hastings later in 1928.
So you finished off the year in Hastings?
Yes, I graduated high school at Hastings and went directly into the Army.
Were you 18 then?
I was 17 when I enlisted, but they held me in inactive reserve until I was 18, and 2 months after I was 18, I was in.
Very interesting. We're going to start the interview formally now, okay? And the way we do it is I'm going to first say my name, the date, where we are, and how old I am. And then you're going to say your name, the date, where we are, and how old you are.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm Louisa Scioscia Stephens. This is October 24th, 2005. We're in the Hastings Historical Society building, the Draper Lab in Hastings-on-Hudson. And I'm interviewing my friend Erich, and I think that's it.
Yeah. Well, I'm Erich Kothe. I'm 80 years old, and I've lived in Hastings a good part of my life. My parents moved to Hastings from Irvington in 1928. On June 25th, 1928, we got off the boat. We immigrated from Germany.
Oh, you did.
And we arrived, and we were sponsored by my father's cousin, Carl Thiele, who owned the bakery on Main Street in Irvington.
So then you moved to Irvington to be near them?
Well, we lived above the bakery for the time being, and my father worked at the General Motors plant, was a Fisher Body plant in Tarrytown, commuted on the railroad to Tarrytown, just a short one stop. And then he, on the weekends, he worked for his cousin, and they delivered bread in Irvington. And one of the customers on his route was Vito Delustro, the manager of the plant at Hastings. And he found himself a better job through Mr. Delustro.
Mr. Delustro could recognize a good man.
Yeah, I guess he could. And my dad, he went to school in Irvington. It was English language for foreigners. So he was gung ho to stay in. He loved the United States till the day he died. He died at 100 years old.
Oh my goodness!
And he became the night superintendent of the Anaconda plant. So he worked himself up from machine operator through foreman became the night superintendent.
Wow.
4 to 12 shift superintendent.
So you didn't see him when you came home from school?
No.
Right.
We used to wave. In those days, people in Hastings, they didn't drive to work; they walked to work. But when we lived up in Uniontown, I'd see him drive his 1936 Pontiac down when I did my paper route in the village. So, it's a long history that I have of Hastings-on-Hudson. I too, after World War II, went to college, became an electrical engineer, and Anaconda Wire and Cable Company was my second job, and I retired from that company in 1986.
Oh wow, 19 years ago. So it was your second job. What was your first job?
I worked for Lavoie Laboratories in Morganville, New Jersey. Uh-huh. It was a research and development laboratory for communications, which they primarily made communications and test equipment for the United States Signal Corps, the Army Signal Corps.
And what did you do at Anaconda?
I started off as a research engineer, then became senior engineer for the government defense products, and became manager of that division, and then became the technical director of the international wire and cable operations for Anaconda. We had plants in Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, and we had technical associations with Ericsson in Sweden and Pirelli in Italy. So I managed that cooperation as well as the international operations.
That was an incredible responsibility.
Oh yeah, it was a good job.
It was a good job. Were you called upon to use German and other languages?
Well, I speak German, and certainly it was helpful when I went to Germany. We had an association, technical association, with Siemens. We visited other German companies. Much of the wire and cable machinery that was built after the war, when total modernization took place, was made in Germany. So it was good to have the language, but I have to say that most Germans speak English as well as the Americans do. They start in kindergarten.
That's right. It's a different.
Yeah,
different in Europe.
Yeah, it is.
Right, and I hadn't realized that the Anaconda had defense contracts.
Oh yeah, it was a big defense contractor. During World War II, it is said that 2/3 of all shipboard cable, both military and for the transport industry, the Liberty ships and so, 2/3 of that cable was made here at Hastings.
Really?
It was virtually everything was devoted to the military during World War II here. You couldn't buy a piece of copper unless you had there was
a military authorization.
Yeah, there was a I forget the name of the organization. It was the War Production Board. You had to have a certificate from the War Production Board to manufacture anything made of copper.
Just because it's so scarce and they needed it.
Well, you have to remember that World War II was not like the wars that followed. The entire country was devoted to the military effort. Now we talk about 5 or 6% of our gross domestic product devoted to military. During World War II, 150% was devoted to it. There was more government than private than for the general public. So that was a totally different situation.
It was psychologically different as well.
Oh yes.
And how did it feel to be in Hastings during the war?
Well, you see, I wasn't in Hastings during the war, except for a short period from December 7th, 1941 until February of 42.
Right.
Then I was involved in a different way.
I see, right. Of course.
And I, when I graduated from high school, I graduated with a commercial certificate or whatever, your high school thing. It wasn't a college entrance thing. So I went to work at Anaconda in the office. And I was only there for several months before, it was perfectly understood that you just had a temporary job when you got out of high school. And the big job was getting into the military, and when I got into the Army, you had all sorts of interviews to see where you would best fit, and I managed to. I was sort of lucky. I was interested in radio. I was in a radio club at the Hastings High School, and they saw fit to send me to the Air Force to radio mechanics and operator school to operate radios on bombers generally. But then they selected a certain group in that school, and we went to. Some of us went to radio mechanics school. And from there, the top of the crop went to radar school, and I was a radar technician during World War II in the 15th Air Force in Italy.
So you were the top of the crop?
Well, I wouldn't say that. The top,
well, they thought so, right?
Well, at school, yeah, for that part, but the top of the crop in the war were the guys that were flying. Oh. And I didn't do much of that. I just flew several missions on specialty occasions.
So you did do some flying. What about tell me about school in Hastings. Going back to you moved here when you were in kindergarten.
Yes. And Mrs. McCarthy was my kindergarten teacher.
Was she nice?
Oh, yeah. No, I think it was the greatest school in you couldn't expect a better school system. I suppose it's the same way now, but it was just fine.
Did you already speak English, or did you only speak German?
I went to kindergarten in Irvington. When I went to kindergarten, I couldn't speak a word of English. When I came out of kindergarten, I was bilingual.
Fabulous.
That's the way it works.
Yeah. And were there a lot of Germans in this area?
This area Well, there were a good number of Germans. It was said that there were more people of German descent in the army in World War II than of all other nations combined.
Ironic, right?
Yeah, and so there were certainly a lot of Germans here, and my parents knew several of them. They got together here, but the general population here was the foreign population was Polish, Italian, Slavic, and it was because of the Anaconda mill that they were here.
Oh, it pulled
Yes,
the workers
yes.
from wherever.
Yeah, many of the Germans went off the boat directly out to the Midwest. You know, Milwaukee with their breweries, and
Right.
Chicago, and were more German, more dominantly German than we were here at Hastings.
Probably the climate was more similar, right?
Yeah, well,
You know what? There's some background noise because of people downstairs. I'm going to stop for a minute and ask them to stop.
Okay.
Okay. I'm just going to.
oh, they're right out there outside the door.
Is that
I think.
right?
I don't think they're downstairs.
Okay. I hope this is the correct thing. Here you are. So, tell us a little bit about school.
Well, school was. I think the teachers were very, very attentive to the students in the school, and we never had more than 20 or 30 students in the class. And there were all sorts of extracurricular activities, but I never participated in them because I was a paper boy. And there were loads of paper boys. I mean, those days we delivered the Yonkers Herald Statesman in Hastings, and there must have been 10, 15 of us had different routes throughout Hastings. My route was down through the village, up Main Street, across Broadway, the La Barranca Apartments. In fact, in this location, down Washington Avenue to the bottom at Ridge Street, then down across what used to be called Southside Avenue. I don't think it's called that, and still that, and that was it. I used to take my bicycle to school, and we lived in Uniontown at that time, and the papers were delivered right here on Olinda Avenue, the corner of Olinda and Farragut. They were piled up there, and we'd come
Different
out of
ones for different paper boys?
yeah, big bundles of different paper. All the paper boys gathered there, picked up their papers, and went. I took mine on my bicycle down to Ansel's. It was a delicatessen at that time, and a bar, and then left my bike in the alleyway, and did
Just
my walked the route and came back. Took the bike and went up to Uniontown.
How long did it take you?
Oh, probably 2 hours, something like that, every day, and half a day on Saturday.
Why was it so much shorter on Saturday?
Well, it was longer on Saturday. We started in the morning collecting. We were independent merchants, us paper boys. We had a contract. In fact, I have that copy of that contract yet. And the paper cost 18 cents a week. And I remember when the paper price went up to 20 cents. That was a disaster for the paper boys because we all got that extra 2 cents in tip.
Oh.
And a nickel was a little bit too much to give to a paper boy in those days.
Right.
But then, I graduated from high school, and it was rather ordinary, I think. There was one interesting thing I had at the high school graduation. In the place where principality or district where we were born in Saxony, it was customary to have your name you by your father's name, give you a middle name, and call you by that middle name, not by your father's name. And this was generally, I know others that were that way. And my name was Erich Kothe when I went through high school, all through school here. Everybody called me Werner. In fact, now I know. And then when I came to graduation, I remember I had to present my birth certificate. I never thought anything of it. And when they called me to come up and get my papers, they said Erich Kothe. I sat there and I wondered who the hell that was. So because Werner sounded too German for me going into the army, I stuck with the Erich part.
Oh, that's interesting, right. There was a consideration then, I guess.
Yes.
Right. So you graduated at 17, you went right into the army.
What happened was in September, in those days you had to volunteer for the draft. The reason for that was that they had an awful lot of volunteers originally. I mean, machinists and people that were important to the military, military in industry, were just volunteering for draft and taking away, and pretty soon the industry suffered. So what you had to do, you had to volunteer for the draft. The draft board had to contact your employer, and of course, as an office boy, you didn't have a deferment by your employer, and they usually gave deferments for a period of time, depending on what category you were, and then you were in. But for me, they enlisted me immediately when I was 17, but they called it the inactive reserve, and I was called up then in February of 1943.
Right. And when you were on inactive reserve, you stayed at home?
Yeah, you didn't even know you were in the Army. I mean, they just said go home. It put you on a different list.
Right.
That's what it amounted to.
Right. So were there a lot of young men in that position in Hastings that joined immediately and stayed home nevertheless until they turned 18?
I don't know, but I think that was only those that volunteered for the draft. And those that volunteered for the draft, we were sort of a bit lucky, because that showed up when we first enlisted in the Army, when they determined what to do with us. I mean, the ones that were drafted, I think that I really believe that it made a little bit of difference to me that I volunteered rather than was drafted, and was selected to go to the Air Force rather than the other divisions of the Army. It was the Army Air Force, incidentally, at that time. It was not a separate. It wasn't separate.
You mean there wasn't a separate one?
There was no Air Force. It was the Army Air Corps.
Right, and you worked there in radar.
Yeah, I was a radar technician.
And did you use that when you came back, or was it?
Well, it was a help in getting through school. What happened was I went to work at Anaconda again for a few months after the war, because I couldn't get couldn't get into the school that I wanted to at the time, and I went to RCA Institute in New York City. There were several industrial institutes that gave engineering degrees. One was the General Motors Institute in New York, and RCA was the institute, of course, for communications and electronics. And I went to that school because, by the time you get out of the Army, you're ready to do something. I mean, you're 3 years old, 4 years older almost, and you're not ready to go into a college with kids coming out of high school. So RCA had a course that was you got your engineering degree in 2 years, 2 years and 3 months. They had a special 3-month indoctrination or math and stuff, because guys were out of school for so long.
Right, and if they learned it, they'd forgotten.
But we didn't do it like the colleges do these days. They really go to school half time. We had 2 weeks off in the summer period, 1 day at Christmas, 1 day at Good Friday, and that was it. And we went to labs on Saturdays. So we did that for 2 years straight.
Right. So it was a 4-year education.
Oh yeah, and they had 200 guys that were accepted in that engineering course, and 60 graduated. It was tough. I mean, you had to spend 4 hours at home at night too, and but we knew what we were doing. We weren't kids out of high school looking for a place to play.
Right. And you also already learned how to focus.
Oh yeah. Of course, a year and a half. I spent a year and a half in technical schools in the Army before I went overseas.
So you really were well educated by the time you got out.
Oh yeah, you did all right.
So what about the education here at Hastings? Did you you liked kindergarten? You loved that?
Well, I liked school. I mean, I think everyone liked school. I mean, it was the thing they did. I mean, I remember there were no school buses except for the very little kids. And in 1933 or thereabouts, I broke my leg, and I was permitted to ride in a school bus right behind Jack and Happy were the two school bus drivers. They owned a taxi company in Hastings, and they drove the two school buses. That's all there were. And everybody would walk to work, even the second, third grade or so. I remember we lived in several houses on Warburton Avenue, and the last one was down Washington Avenue, just at the footbridge of the Anaconda plant. We walked to work from there, and one of the my best friends was his name was what was his nickname now? Armando Carvalho.
Armando Carvalho?
Armando Carvalho was Portuguese. At the time, we didn't know what nationality, and we knew that we thought if everything was either Italian or Slavic or
Polish, you said.
Polish, and he was in the Italian category. I thought, but Armando and I went on the same troop train from Ardsley. Ardsley was where they had the draft board, and it was, I guess it was in February. We went down there, and he had an Army serial number, just 6 numbers different from mine. Can you turn it off?
Sure. I don't know how to pause it, but and I'm afraid, in fact, that I lost everything we talked about before. But
Okay. Armando never returned from the war. He was killed in Germany.
So there's those chilling things, right? And
But I don't remember much about high school, our school, except that I graduated about 10th in the class of 100, and we were all everyone was compatible. I mean, there was no hostility between any of the kids at school. There was no hostility among the teachers, between us and the teachers. We just went there to learn, and we seemed to be happy to get an education. We got a lot of we had Mr. Yard was the shop teacher for woodworking, and Mr. Blakesley was the shop teacher for metalworking. And
were those down in the basement the way they were when I first moved here?
Yes, they were. They were downstairs.
Right, with all that heavy equipment.
Yeah.
And the school, what did the school actually look like?
Well, there were when I went to kindergarten, there were 2 schools, the lower grades and then the high school, and there was a space in between them.
Like an alleyway or something?
No, it was an open courtyard between them. And during the Depression, they had the what was the name of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and they built a school to connect the 2. And that was where the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades are now, I think, and that's where I went to 6th grade. I remember at 2:00 in the afternoon, and that's when the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, built Farragut Parkway. It was just a narrow street at the time, and they built the parkway. And I remember at 2:00 every afternoon, Mrs. Carey, who was our 6th grade teacher, okay, to the windows, and we watched these workmen pour concrete, and they've had the machinery out there, and she let us watch for 15 or 20 minutes as the progress was going on, and then we went back and...
That was fabulous. But how did they make it? If it was a narrow lane,
Well, there was plenty of space on each side, but it was just
the houses
weren't up against the road.
Oh.
Yeah, they made it. I guess it's 4 lanes most of the way, but nothing in the middle. But that was those are the 2 big construction projects in Hastings during the Depression era.
I wonder how did they? How was it decided what would happen with the WPA crew?
I don't know. I have no idea. But it was just to make work, because during the Depression there were so many people unemployed. So it was during the beginning of the Roosevelt administration that they formed the WPA.
Was Hastings, even though it had Anaconda, did it suffer from unemployment?
Oh yes.
Oh, it did.
Oh yes. I mean, the economy was such that there was no housing, relatively little housing or no housing being built. There was no expansion of the economy, so that many people didn't work full days. They worked maybe 2 days a week or something like that. And there were people that were unemployed that were previously employed at Anaconda.
Oh, I see. So Anaconda's dropped their workforce.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was the Burnham Boiler Factory in Irvington that made boilers for homes. That, of course, went south as well. And all these industries along the Hudson were some of them maintained operations on a part-time basis.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, in 1933, my mother and father and I went to Germany during the summer, and my father went also because there was no work here. When he came back, things started to pick up a bit, and he worked part-time. My mother worked as a cook at Ansel's Delicatessen. It was kind of a deli and a restaurant. And
That's down on Washington and
it's
South
on
Side?
it's on the corner of Main Street and Warburton Avenue. It's now
Hastings House?
no, it's still a restaurant. It's I don't know what the name of it is, but it's a restaurant that's just at the Ravine Bridge.
Oh. Ravine Bridge. Well, then, isn't it? Is it near Washington and Warburton?
No, it's on the Main Street end.
On the Main Street end.
Yeah, there's a corner building on Main Street in Warburton on the southeast corner, and this is on the building right next to it, and the porch overlooks the ravine. It's right on the beginning of the bridge, on the would be the north end of the bridge.
Oh, is it a seafood place now?
Yes, I think so.
Yes,
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah.
Oh, so that's where your mother worked
Yes.
as a cook.
Yeah.
Did you go down and visit her? You must have been just about 10 or something.
I lived
right?
there practically.
Really?
I mean, when I came back from school, I was a little kid. I stayed there,
Yeah.
and Mr. Ansel was like my grandfather, and Gene Ansel was like my brother. He was a son, Helen Ansel. And we all kind of lived together there.
Oh, that's very nice.
Just went home at night.
Yeah. And did they live upstairs?
The Ansels lived upstairs, yes.
Yeah. Right. And you said that there were tenements down. Where did you say there were tenements?
Well, we all along Warburton Avenue, those houses that have been modernized now were all workers' tenements. And one of the houses we lived in was kind of a hexagon front, and they was maybe 4 stories high. They tore the upper 3 stories off, and just made it a private home now.
Really?
Yeah, and the last apartment we lived in was the first one which was heated, which was a hot water flat. The others were all cold water flats.
But what does that mean? Does it mean you're cold?
That means that the only thing you had there was a faucet with cold water coming in, and the rest you had to do for yourself.
I see. You had to heat water for
You
bath.
had to heat water for baths and everything else. You put big pots of boiling water on the wood-fired cooking stoves and poured them into a.
So you heated
tub.
by wood fire?
Yeah.
So you had those big iron stoves?
Yeah, that's right. There's iron cook stoves,
Ah.
and in fact, the wood came from Anaconda. There was a reel shop there. You know these reels which are round? Of course,
Yes,
boards
right.
don't come round. All those edges that are cut off day after day after day, the lumber piled up. And one of the entrepreneurs in town, I think it was named Mr. Costello, went down there and he delivered wood to all these people.
Oh, that's very
You know,
interesting. But he'd have to carry it upstairs to different people's apartments?
Yeah, people. Well, no, most of those apartments had a basement room for storage, and that's where they stored the wood.
Oh, I see. So probably you were sent down to get some wood.
Oh
from the
yeah,
fire.
well that's what the
Right.
kids all
Eric-
went
no,
down.
Werner
Yeah, Werner went down. And the last apartment we lived in, as I said, was at the foot of Washington Avenue, just at the bottom of this hill. And we were at the top floor, and the apartment was in the back, and it had now they call them decks. In those days, we call them a big porch, and it overlooked the Hudson. It was gorgeous, and it was the only apartment where we had steam heat and hot water, and I think we probably paid $20 a month in those days for it. And I recently learned through a painter that did some painting on our house that painted the inside of that apartment.
The same apartment?
The same apartment, and it now rents for $2,500 a month.
Goodness, so 100 times as much, wow. So did you appreciate that view?
Oh yeah. We didn't have, I don't, when you're a child, you get used to it. You don't appreciate things as much as you do when you become an adult.
Right.
I mean, it's gorgeous now. I look at the Hudson all the time. Whenever I come down here, I take the opportunity to look over the Palisades. Right. In those days, it was just one of these things that were there,
So did your mother, I feel like I would love it. Did your mother appreciate, you probably didn't even know as a kid, right, whether she appreciated it or not?
Oh, my mom loved everything. She left it, yeah. She's still living. She's 100. She'll be 101 in December.
Oh my goodness.
My dad passed away last year at the age of 100.
So that bodes well for you.
I always say it skips a generation. My children and grandchildren look better than I am.
Did you have brothers and sisters growing up?
No.
But except for the Ansel,
pseudo
right,
family.
Right. Yeah. So you lived in several different places in Hastings.
Well, we moved every time the rent got cheaper someplace else during the Depression. We had, it was a matter of money.
Well, that's very interesting. The landlords also were trying to.
Oh yeah, the landlords were in competition to fill up their places, and as wages went down, not up in those days. Yeah. As wages went down and the rents went down, you looked for the least expensive rent, and there you were. You moved, and you didn't have much to move. A bed and a couple of bureaus, and that was it. Not like today.
Right.
It would take a steamship to move me out of my home now, but those days it was different.
So it was a good life, it sounds like. It sounds like people were nice to each other. And...
it was altogether different. One of our daughters lives in Vermont, in northern Vermont, in Colchester near Burlington, and she says she wouldn't let her. They have little granddaughters and one grandson up there. She says she wouldn't let her daughters drive the bike from the end of the block to the house because nowadays everyone is afraid things are going to happen.
In Vermont, she feels that?
Oh, yeah. But there's so much. The news is so different. The news is news. Whenever something horrible happens, you hear about it. Whether it happens in California or Florida or next door.
Or Pakistan.
Yeah, right. So that, you become afraid. What we did here, during the summers, we'd get a couple of guys together in the evenings, and we decide what we're going to do the next day. We'd tell our mothers what we were going to do, and she'd pack a sandwich. We'd leave at breakfast, and she never knew where we were till we came home from supper.
And that was how it was with all the kids?
That was, all the kids.
What did you do?
Well, one of the things we did, we made a little money. We'd walk from down here in the village up across Farragut Road, it was at that time, down to the Sawmill River. There was a Sawmill River Bridge. The Sawmill River Parkway was there, but there was no problem crossing it. There was hardly one every 10 minutes a car would come up the way. And there was a bridge which was not across Ravensdale Road. Now the bridge goes across the parkway and across the Sawmill River. But in the fall, if you look down there, you see a concrete slab going across the sawmill. Just a concrete slab. Well, that had wooden posts on it, and that was the traffic bridge. It doesn't look like it could carry one lane now, but we'd go fishing over that bridge. You could see, we called them sucker fish. I think they were carp. And we'd take a treble hook and we'd hook them. Then we'd get these fish and we'd put them in a bag that we carried, and then we'd hike down to the Hudson River. And down in Hudson River, they had crab fishermen throwing crab nets. And we'd sell those for a nickel apiece to the crabbers. Gave them
And they were using
5
as
cents
bait?
for a fish. They'd use them for bait in their crab nets. Then we'd take that 5 cents and walk up to Bruning's ice cream parlor on Warburton Avenue by the theater, get an ice cream, and go home. By that time, it was dark.
That sounds like a well-spent day.
And there was always something to do. We'd be in the quarry all day long. The quarry was
And the
open.
quarry was over here.
It was right down
Right,
here,
right,
just east of the aqueduct from here.
right. And it was just a big open quarry. Was
It
it being?
There was an open pit, and it was filled with water down below, and the sheer walls of the quarry rose up on the hillside, and they had tapped out all the marble.
It was marble.
There was a
quarry?
marble quarry, and there was no marble left. Then it was sandstone, and they had a couple of caves dug through the sandstone for the purpose of exploring to see if there was more marble back in there. And now those caves were playgrounds for us kids.
That's right. They would be terribly intriguing.
Yeah.
But how did you get to them from the sheer cliffs?
Well, there's a picture in one of these Hastings Historical Society magazines of the kids clambering up. There was a little walkway up, and there was another one, and I wrote an article. When I saw that, I wrote to them, and they published it. And then there was another walk where you faced the sheer cliff, and there was just a little ledge, and you'd walk into this cave. We get into that cave, and we'd be like a cat up in a tree. We'd be afraid to get down again. We'd spend the day in there till we got hungry.
And then hunger would drive you down, but
Yeah, well, not hunger, but we'd have to come down eventually. But it was we dare you to go first sort of thing, But there was always things to do around here.
did you swim in the Hudson?
Yes, yeah, and how frightening things we did. Everyone did this. To save time, we walk across the railroad tracks, and of course the third rails are 700 volt. They're electrified. And usually we'd walk back over the bridge by Zinzer's, but if we lived on this end of town, we didn't want to go all the way around. When we came back, we'd step on the wooden. In those days, they had wood to protect the top of the third rail. Now they have polyethylene or black polypropylene they clip on. But in those days, it was wood. You'd step on the wood, and you get a tingle if it was a little bit damp. I remember one day we really got discouraged. One day there was a small dog that was wet, and he was swimming with his owner, and walked under the third rail and got electrocuted. And this dog flew up about 5 feet into the air. Of course, he came back down dead. And oh God, we ran away from that.
And the owner was amongst you?
I don't. It was an elderly person that was there, and we didn't know him, but. And then there was an accident. One of the boys were playing tag, and it was down near the Tower Ridge Yacht Club, I guess. It was the yacht club that was just north of the Anaconda building, and he climbed up on the steel towers, which carried the power for the railroad, and he was set afire. He was killed there. One of the O'Leary brothers. So we learned about electricity the hard way.
Right, and then you became an electrical engineer.
Yeah, right. I got a lot of shocks in my life, but yeah. Well, so it went.
It sounds very, very appealing. Very appealing. So anybody in particular that you can remember from your time when you were young, let's say a teenager?
Oh well, we still have friends.
Oh, they're still here.
Oh yeah, they're still here. There's Billy Shields. He lived right across the street here, on top of Washington Avenue, right next to the building where the Mayor Steinsnyder lived, and he built boats. He was a little genius with wood, and he was a paper boy, and he now lives in Rhode Island. We see him once or twice a year. He comes by and visits his son down here. And Billy Shields, he went to the Coast Guard, And there's Bill Daly. Bill Daly's father was the paint foreman in the Anaconda, and he was my next door neighbor in Uniontown on Rose Street. He was a paper boy. In fact, he got me my first job with the Yonkers Herald Statesman. And Billy was one grade behind me. He graduated in 43, and I graduated in 42. And I was in Italy in a tent in the 44th Bomb Group in the 825th Squadron, and all of a sudden, Bill Daly walks in. He's a gunner on a bolt-turret gunner on the B-17 in a squadron and a bomb group near Foggia. And he came to see me again. And the second time I had to go on a mission down to Naples. It was during the invasion of southern France. That's where the southern invasion fleet started. And I didn't see him, and he left a note for me. And he gave me directions to his bomb group in his tent, and when I went up to see him, he'd been shot down. He was a prisoner of war. He survived. And he became a professor, an art professor.
An art professor?
Yeah. And we correspond and we talk to one another by phone. He lives down there in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania Art Institute, I think it was.
Where he's working?
Yeah, where he's retired now too. In fact, I think he's at this moment in Korea. He is a ceramics artist, and he's over there with his son. They're doing some work on an exhibit over there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So the guys at Hastings High School did all right.
That's right. That's right. And also that paper delivery group did all right.
Oh yeah.
It sounds like that was a friendship.
Oh, it was. It was. There was a at the bottom of the corner of Division Street and Warburton Avenue. Was called the paper office. We went there we'd all of us go make our rounds on Saturday without the newspapers to make the collections. People weren't usually at home when we got there, so we'd collect on Friday afternoons, and what was left over we'd collect before we got to the paper office. Because when we got to the paper office, we had to pay our bill. See, we had to pay I don't know what, 18 cents or whatever it was per paper per week. And they had a ping pong table there, and we drank a lot of Pepsi-Cola. It was across the street. We get paid, and we go across the street and get a couple of Pepsi-Colas before we went on our paper route that day. So it was a great camaraderie among us guys.
It really sounds like
Yeah.
it. Did you meet your wife when you were living in Hastings?
No. My folks' first ownership of a home was a summer home on Lake Secor. It's in Mayapack, near Lake Mayapack, and just 25-30 miles up. And it was a small cottage that we built, and that was my training in carpentry.
So you and your father and mother built it?
No, what happened was that it was built during the summer, and they hired a carpenter, and what was his name? Teddy Ackerman. He was a Norwegian, a big Norwegian, and you never saw a bigger man in your life. And I was up there I had to stay up there and be his helper. I slept in a cottage next door for friends of our parents. He slept in a hammock outside with the mosquitoes, and I was his cook, and the only thing he ate was eggs and bacon. And this guy could hammer a nail. He hammered an 8-penny nail, just hit it once, and drive it in. Instead of tapping it 100 times, one hit, and he went along that way. And I enjoyed that summer. I cooked his meal, and my mother came up since my father worked the 4 to 12 shift. My father came up on Wednesdays, middle of the week. My mother had a big pot of stew, which would last for a couple of days, and that's what we did. And I remember every evening after we finished work and had our dinner, I'd go down to the lake and swim across and swim back and then go start the next day. Start at 6 o'clock in the morning. You know, it was no problem with making noise in those days. People just said, "Well, they're building a house. That's all there is to it. They got to build it sometime." And I built my own home too here in town of Greenburgh, and in the Ardsley School District.
From the skills you learned there.
And the question you asked was, did I meet my wife here?
Yes.
They had a bungalow across the street. I've known my wife since she was 14.
Oh, really? That's a grand way to.
Yeah, we've had our 55th wedding anniversary not too long ago, last year.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
So, and you both live in Hastings?
No, we both live.
Oh, in Ardsley.
Ardsley.
Yeah.
It's a strange thing. It's the town of Greenburgh. We have a White Plains mailing address, and we're in the Ardsley School District.
Right. You know, a terrible thing. I think when I turned this off to quiet the people down,
Yeah.
I think I lost everything that we talked about beforehand.
Oh, gee.
I feel terrible, but I don't think we can reconstruct all of it. But could we just reintroduce ourselves?
Sure.
So we'll do that. So at least that's on there. And if there's anything from that early part of coming over from Germany that you'd like to talk about again, or if you feel up to talking about
You sure you lost it?
I'm pretty sure.
You can't get it back again. I mean,
I don't know.
you don't know how.
Yeah. Well, let's at least
okay.
At least reintroduce ourselves, and then if there's anything else you feel like talking, we'll talk more, and otherwise.
All right.
Okay, so I'll start. Okay, so I'm Louisa Scioscia Stephens. It's October 24th, 2005. I'm in Hastings-on-Hudson at the Historical Society, and I'm interviewing my friend Erich.
Yes, I'm Erich Kothe. I've lived in Hastings for a good part of my youth, and still now live in the area, and I've worked at Anaconda Wire and Cable Company for most of my career. I'm 80 years old, and I'm waiting for another question here.
Well, let's just talk a tiny bit again about coming from Germany.
Oh yeah, well, I'm an immigrant, but I arrived at the port of New York on June 25th, 1928, with my mother and father. I was 3.5 years old at the time, and we were sponsored by my father's cousin, Carl Thiele, they call him here, I guess, and he had a bakery on Main Street in Irvington. And my dad got a job at the Fisher Body Works, which was, I guess, was then later to be General Motors in Tarrytown. He was sanding hoods out in the hot summer, outdoors, polishing cars and stuff. And during the weekends, or on Saturday at least, he delivered bread with his uncle in his Chevrolet. And one of the customers was Vito Delustro, who was the manager of the Anaconda plant at Hastings. And it's through him that he'd gotten his first job, and his first job was working a machine operator. He then became a foreman in several divisions of the manufacturing operation, and then he was then a 4 to 12 shift superintendent for most of his career at Anaconda.
So he worked his way.
Yeah, worked his way up. Right. And I went to kindergarten, as I said earlier. I went to kindergarten in Irvington. It was just a block away. And when I entered kindergarten, I spoke only German because my parents spoke only German, and they didn't know any English at the time until my father went to the Irvington High School in the evenings. They had classes, English classes for non-English speaking people. And as I went into kindergarten, speaking and understanding only German. When I got out, I was bilingual. We went to first grade at Hastings. My first grade teacher was Mrs. McCarthy, and the story goes on from there.
Right. Well, are there any last things you'd like to talk about about your memories of Hastings? Anything that you wished I'd asked?
Not that I could think of at the moment, but it was a great place to grow up. I mean, there was freedom like you don't have today. Freedom from your parents. You just wandered all over the place. We had the river to swim in. It was a lot dirtier then than it is now. I mean, we had to occasionally get out of the water because of the dyes that were dumped in by the Zinsser dye factory. You could see the water change color and the kids come out purple.
Oh my goodness. So that was a dye factory.
And there were no sewage plants. This raw sewage was dumped into the Hudson too. Then but we still it was our swimming hole. We also swam in Sawmill River, but there was no swimming area because it fed the. It was Yonkers. Yonkers used the water as domestic water, but
that's drinking water.
Drinking water, but that didn't bother us much. We were caught once by the Parkway police.
But you weren't shot.
No, they didn't. We used to keep our clothes on a sandbar in the middle of the river, so no matter which side the police came on, we'd run to the other side. But and we sailed. I remember I told you about Billy Shields.
You told me he was a boat builder.
He built small boats, and we'd go sailing with him. Bill Shields, Bill Daly, and myself. Always the three of us.
Always in the Hudson.
In the Hudson, but just across the river from the north end of Hastings, is somebody built like a Roman garden. It had pillars, ionic tops on the pillars and beams across the top and vegetation growing alongside. And there was a stream that came out of the center of the Palisades, and it made a pool underneath
it. Was underground water?
No, the water came out of the. It was a stream that came right out of the middle of the Palace Spring, sort of, but a big volume of water came cascading down, and that basalt, the rock, it carved a swimming pool, and the swimming pool was as smooth as a piece of glass. It was just ground out by this moving water all the time. It was fresh, cool water. We went over there in the evening and went for a swim and sailed back. We didn't have anything like an outboard motor. But then turned out to be a problem after December 7th, 1941. We were in high school then. And in order to have any pleasure boat on the river, one needed a Coast Guard permit. And one could only be on the river from sun up to sundown. And of course we didn't know how to get a permit. So the only option we had was to sail after dark when no one was allowed on the river. And the Anaconda plant had 2 guard towers that they built at the corners of the plant, which had searchlights, and they had guys up there with guns, to keep looking for. They were afraid of saboteurs because this was an important military plant during that war years. But we'd have to be sure we sailed out of range of those searchlights to get across to our pool.
It's sort of like the third rail, right?
Yeah, right. And then one night on the way back, that was our last night of sailing at night, Billy and I were alone, and we were sailing back, and he had his boat just across the border in Yonkers, in a small, junky marina, moored offshore. So we had to swim out to the boat and back. But one of the things that had happened was we were coming back and almost to shore when Billy said, "What happened to the train?" We could see the lights of the New York Central Railroad train, and they had disappeared. Billy said, "The train, what happened to the train?" Of course, the train was right along the river, and what had happened, there was a tug. It wasn't pulling a barge, it was tied alongside a big empty barge, and the barge blocked the view of the river, and we were almost under the front of the scow. We hit the barge, pushed ourselves away, and when we got back, Billy and I thought things over. He says, "If we had been under that barge, our parents would never have known what had happened to us. Because we wouldn't dare tell them we were sailing in a river at night.
So such a happy childhood, but really fraught with danger.
Yeah, but we didn't know it. Yeah.
That's a good story.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of good stories. So, is there anything else you'd like to tell me about?
Well, I could go on for hours
Well,
here,
go,
but
go
I don't really remember. I'm sure you're interested mostly in what happened during the days I lived in Hastings, but
Well, I'm interested in anything.
yeah. Well, when we didn't get married until 1950, and then I worked down in Lavoie Laboratories for a couple of years, and well, we looked around for another job, and as a matter of fact, I applied when I got out of got my degree at RCA. I applied again at Hastings, at the engineering department of the research center. And
You mean at Anaconda?
yeah, at Anaconda, but there was no openings. There were no openings at the time. So it turned out that I had gotten a job at CGS Laboratories in Stamford, Connecticut. And my wife worked in the National Tuberculosis Association as a secretary in New York. She commuted to Mattawan, where we lived down in Jersey. And she left for work in the morning, and I had a 1949 Chevy that we had for 14 years before it passed out, and it was loaded, and she went by train to work, and I was to see if I can find an apartment in Stamford. We had already looked in Stamford unsuccessfully, and this day she went to work, and I stopped to unload the car onto my parents' porch it was an enclosed porch on Spring Street, down Spring Street. And while I was there, the phone rang, and my father answered it, and then he says, "Well, you can talk to him, he's right here." So it was Art Jones, who was the head of the laboratory, and he was, I guess, the assistant chief engineer at Hastings in the engineering department. And he said, "We'd like to talk to you. We've seen your application, and there's a job opening for designing high-frequency transmission lines." The person who was doing that, Al Widmer, was reassigned to a special project on field wire for the Korean War was then on. And we'd like to talk to you. So I went down, talked to him, took the job, found an apartment on Mount Hope Boulevard in Hastings, got the apartment, and my wife showed up at my father's house. She said, "Well, did you get the apartment?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Where is it?" I said, "Come on, I'll show it to you." She said, "Are you going to commute here from there to Stamford?" I said, "No, I got a different job. I got a job in Hastings." So, and she commuted. There was the Putnam Division was running steam trains at the time.
On a track to the east of here?
Yeah, in those days there was the Hudson Division, the Putnam Division, the Harlem Division, and the New Haven Division. They were all running except the Putnam Division. That's now the bike trail that runs from here all the way up to, I guess you can go up to Albany on the thing, or at least up to Brewster in that area. But there was a footbridge at Mount Hope, at the foot of Mount Hope Boulevard, that went over the Parkway and went right down to the railroad station. We lived in the house that adjoined that footbridge.
Oh,
So my wife walked down, went across the bridge, and got on the steam train. And the steam trains, of course, couldn't go into the tunnels in New York. They stopped at High Bridge. And from there, they had to walk across the bridge, a small footbridge, to get onto the electric trains to go into the city. And that's how she commuted for quite a number of years.
And you really just walked west.
And I just walked to Anaconda, took my car down.
Yeah. Now those steam trains,
Locomotives.
Did they burn coal?
Coal.
Coal burning.
Yeah, they were coal burners.
Yeah.
I remember I remember that when they abandoned those for diesels. The first time they put a diesel on, something went wrong with the diesel, and they had to pull a steam engine up ahead and pull the train. Everybody applauded the steam engine. Yeah. So the times have changed in our short lifetimes here in these communities.
Right. When did they stop running trains there?
Well, it must have been in the early 50s. Yeah, it was in the 50s sometime. I don't think they went into the 60s. But they continued running diesels, and you still had to switch over at High Bridge to get on the diesel electrics.
I see.
So, but then of course they abandoned the route altogether. They left the route open, but they didn't run commuter rails on it. They left it open because there was an big A&P warehouse in Elmsford. It's not there anymore, but they had an agreement to run a certain number of trains a week to supply the A&P warehouse from New York. So then I guess that contract ran out, and then they tore the tracks up.
And what did your wife do for commuting then?
By the time that happened, she became a housewife. What we did, we had a routine. We bought a piece of property up a dirt road. Now it was Woodlands Avenue. It was a dirt road at the time, and it was an acre of land, and it was 100 feet wide, 400 feet deep, big parcels all along this dirt road. And so I built a house. I actually built it. I mean, I was an engineer, so I knew what I was doing. I had this experience with a carpenter when I was a kid, and it wasn't that uncommon for GIs coming back to build their own houses. You know, it was a head start in life. My wife keeps bringing it up to me that it was her money that bought the land. It was $1,600 for the acre, and she sold her war bonds that she had accumulated during World War II to buy the piece of property. And we just bought wood. All I had to do was borrow $5,000 from my father to
get sufficient materials?
Yeah. In those days, we moved in. Of course, I kept rebuilding the house. We put additions onto it and so forth.
But what about did you put in electricity and plumbing?
Yeah, I did that. But well, the plumbing on the original house I had done. All the rest of the heating I did when we expanded upstairs and out. I did that all myself. I did the wiring. And I had a licensed electrician come in and look it over and cover me with it. That's what was done in those days. But
and so your children grew up and went to school in Ardsley?
Oh, they all graduated in Ardsley. They were all born in a White Plains hospital. They all graduated in Ardsley. One of our son went to New York, SUNY College at was it Middletown? It's not there anymore. It's up near where Cornell is, in that godforsaken frozen area of the state. The other daughter went to the University of Rhode Island on an athletic scholarship.
What was her sport?
She's a runner. In fact, she's still a runner. She's just going to be, I think, her fourth New York marathon that she's running, and her younger sister, not younger anymore, but she's running with her this time. She made the marathon 3 hours, 12 minutes, 22 seconds. Pretty good for a girl. She's in the top 100 ladies.
Wow.
So she went to University of Rhode Island, and she's in Florida. She works in Florida. And the other daughter went to the University of Rhode Island, and now you know why she stayed there. She got married up there.
Right.
So don't send your children to foreign universities. They may never come back.
It's a terrible thing. You have to make that risk.
Oh yeah. Well, she's doing fine.
Yeah. So your grandchildren come down.
Yeah. Oh, we see them. The house is full at Christmas time. Yeah. Everyone's together. and we get together 4 or 5 times a year.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, Eric, it's been a grand interview.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to stop this now.
Okay.
I'm sort of